somebody looked around and saw my pitch and said, that's a good title for what this thing is. And next thing I know, they're telling me we're going to use this title. Out of all the 90s characters, mutant characters, Chamber is the most visually iconic. He's probably got the best deal in terms of character equity that anybody has ever had, in terms of the success that character has had in other media. It certainly isn't a deal that has been repeated. None of us have ever gotten that deal with the characters we've created.
Welcoming for the first time to Thinking Critical YouTube, we have Mr. Joe Casey, legendary writer from Uncanny X-Men, Cable. We got some Superman stuff in there. Doc's favorite thing ever, Wildcats 3.0. Welcome to the channel, Joe.
Thanks, Wes. Yep, I've been around.
Absolutely. Not only in comic books, but certainly you've made quite the impact in animation as well.
Yeah, had a few successes there. It's been an interesting career so far.
Absolutely, and you've got a big book coming out, obviously, that we're going to talk a whole lot about. And I've noticed that you're doing quite a bit more comic book work as of late. We've got, I think, Johnny Quest going on right now. We've got another Image book. It's Blood Squad 7, and I think we've got Weapon X-Men coming up too.
Well, I love comics. I love writing comics, and I've had recently some opportunities to do more than I've been doing in the past. I've been the last 10, 12 years, I've been mostly creator-owned Image work, where I sort of get my creative rocks off and get to do the weird projects that are
like Godland.
Yeah, Godland and Butcher Baker, Jesus Freak, 1975, The Bounce, Sex. It's been great, but I actually kind of missed being in the trenches. And I also sort of thought, now I'm not the only one who's expressed this, as I've found, is that sort of, mainstream superhero comics, Marvel and DC, that work for hire stuff, every so often it sort of, the energy is dipped a little bit. And those of us who grew up in that system, I think, have been looking at it going, man, let's get some energy back into those books, into those lines, and see if we can still make some noise in that area. And, so I think that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah, I talk to Mark Miller every once in a while, and he likes to study the trends in comic books. I guess he's more into the analytical statistics side to it. I guess there's this bigger trend, like every 20 years you go through a cyclical up and then a down, and then you kind of come back up when something else becomes innovative and groundbreaking. We're actually due for that 20 years to kind of go back up in the upswing on something groundbreaking to come in. You think back in the 80s with a Watchmen type thing, or Bendis coming over to Marvel and kind of changing the way we looked at superhero comic books. But he thinks maybe the pandemic and the shutdown and everything might have delayed it a little bit. But I'm waiting for this amazing upswing. Not that there hasn't been great stuff out there, but I want that energy. I want that enthusiasm back into comic books. It's certainly going to take some great people coming back at this point, but it kind of feels like there might be more opportunities for that, as it looks like Hollywood's kind of contracting a little bit.
Yeah, I think what disrupts those models that Mark is talking about is the media. I don't know, not breakdown, but how you can never predict. You could never predicted how the media would have changed and altered and not been so centralized. When there's a centralized media, it's easy to predict trends because that is the backbone of delivery. But now with things so fractured, I think those trends are harder to predict and harder to even influence. The only thing you can do is your best work, and hopefully people find it, and it's going to become more self-generating than it used to be, I think.
I've got to ask you about this Weapon X-Men. Obviously, it's coming out on Wednesday. It's been the weirdest story, or at least one of the weirdest stories I've seen just as a commentator, because I hear about things behind the scenes. And a couple of years ago, someone's talking about, hey, Joe Casey's going to come back, and he's doing this Wolverine kind of centric book. It's going to be a team book, but it's got a cool name. It's Weapon X-Men. I was like, yeah, that's a pretty cool name. And I remember Marvel announces Weapon X-Men, and there's no Joe Casey, and it doesn't resemble the rumor that I've gotten that what it's supposed to be like. And I was kind of scratching my head, and I was like, that's kind of weird. And then somebody was like, no, someone stole his title. I was like, did they steal titles? And then we get the confirmation that the Joe Casey Weapon X-Men is coming up. I was like, thank goodness, because I know this thing's been in the works for a long time. And then I get to the solicitations and it says One World Under a Tube. I was like, I believe this was conceived and started well before One World Under Doom probably was even thought of. And then I got to the solicitation for issue 2 and it wasn't there. And I was like, what is going on here? It's only the first issue, One World Under Doom. So I do think it's caused this enormous amount of confusion. I feel like I'm tied in a little bit more because I do cover this stuff on a daily basis. But I imagine there's a lot of people out there going, what is Weapon X-Men? Is this volume 2, but it's One World Under Doom for one issue?
Well, here's the funny thing about all that, because you just kind of summed it up pretty nicely. The interesting and ironic thing about it is, with the way that comic book marketing is now anyway, that confusion has at least put a light on the series that it might not have had otherwise. So, I mean, and look, I try not to be cynical, so I have to look at it that way, otherwise I go crazy. But yeah, I pitched this thing. Cold pitched it to Marvel probably, I think it was May of 2023. So we're going on almost 2 years ago. And it was meant to be part of whatever was going to follow up this Krakoan era. Everybody knew that it was coming to an end and it was going to wrap up. And it was starting to, the waters were starting to churn as what was going to come after. So I pitched this as something that could possibly come after. And it was received very well by the previous editorial administration. I mean, it's a big commercial idea. It's Wolverine, it's Deadpool, it's Cable. I mean, to me, those are the new big three at Marvel. They're all movie stars. They're all well-known outside of comics, enormously well-known. And admittedly, I knew the Deadpool Wolverine movie was coming a year later, so I thought the timing would be right. And then there was the editorial change-up that everybody who's plugged into this stuff is familiar with, and things got shifted and moved, and Tom Brevoort came in and he had his own ideas about things, and so it got delayed, got pushed. It was never a sense of that it would not happen. It was just a matter of when. In the meantime, the pitch was sitting there, and there was this other project that needed that had a previous title, had its own title that was then, I guess, earmarked to be part of the new Brevoort launch. And Brevoort had said to the editors, they said, "Look, I'd like to use that title for my new, what became the From the Ashes movement. So you guys just use another title. I'd like to use that title, and you guys just find another title." And then he went away, and somebody looked around and saw my pitch and said, "That's a good title for what this thing is." And next thing I know, they're telling me we're going to use this title, and I was warm, to say the least. I was very warm. And
musical chairs with titles. No idea.
And it's funny because I've been in this business a long time. I know how things work. It's not my title necessarily. I mean, I just took something that hadn't been thought of by anybody. Nobody had thought of this. And I even kind of make a joke out of it in the first issue, because in the story, Deadpool thinks of the team name, and then has a little mini rant about how no one had thought of it before him. And that's basically what I said to Brevoort in a phone call when I found out this had gone on. And it's funny, he had said, look, we'll probably still do this. It's a good idea. It's got merit, and we think it'll sell. Maybe we'll do it with a different title, though. And I said, "Look, Tom, if we do this, I want the title just so I can tell this story, And there's not a better title anyway." So I crossed my fingers, I tightened my sphincter, and we went ahead with the title as is, and like I said, the confusion and this kind of story, aside from what I thought was the obvious commercial hook, has been its own marketing hook. It's been a talking point for people like yourself, and so I kind of look at the bright side of it as being that, and hopefully now that the book is coming out, the work will speak for itself, and it'll find an audience, and we can just kind of move on from there. Because I think the book has its merits beyond the title and beyond the sort of weirdness that surrounded its creation.
Did you ever consider doing Weapon X-Men like 2.0, going back to your Wildcats days?
Well, no, because it had no connection to the what they had done, none whatsoever. Yeah. So I didn't. I didn't want
any. Can't even look at it like that.
Yeah, I didn't want it to be. And listen, you can't. The way that retailers order their books now, the way they get information, there was going to be that association anyway. So I didn't want
Sorry,
to potentially double down on it because this is its own thing.
Definitely agree with Brevort that this definitely has merit. I think people are going to like it because it is an awesome team. You've got the 3 best X-Men characters that could all hold a series on their own. There aren't many X-Men characters that can really do that. Wolverine, Deadpool, Cable. You throw Chamber in there, kind of a little bit of a foil, and then you get John Proudstar. It's pretty cool. What I thought, I enjoyed the book, and we'll get some of those details. But we don't get to see Chris Cross very often in modern comic books anymore. Obviously, he was an enormous name in Milestone and had done some other really good work. I think the last time I saw him was on like a Green Lantern 80th anniversary series. I think he did a short story in there with Dwayne McDuffie's wife. He hasn't missed a beat. His art is just as good, if not a little bit better.
Yeah, he's always been great. I've worked with him a couple times in the past. We've been friends for many years. It's tough to find artists that have the sensibility that you want. I mean, I have my one foot in the old school and one foot in the future. That's my whole vibe, I'd like to think. So, and I wanted to work with somebody that was of my generation, but was not so old school that it would turn off, new fans. And Cross he's the best of both worlds. I mean, he kills it on this book. It's really, really cool stuff.
Oh yeah, you see so many artists today that are completely trying to, I wouldn't say mimic, but they're certainly influenced and they've got a lot of crisscross in them. But as far as the writing goes, it's got all the stuff you kind of want in a Cable, Deadpool, Wolverine book. It's tremendously violent. There's lots of action in there, but there's also an enormous amount of humor. There's some meta humor. Obviously, you got to have that with Deadpool. Speaking of the Weapon X-Men name and all that stuff, he's like, hey, look, it's already got a logo.
I'm a big team book guy. I mean, I grew up on, Avengers and X-Men and Justice League and New Teen Titans and Defenders. All that stuff is that's what I love. So I'm bringing all of my team book DNA to this thing. And I feel like these characters are all in their own way loners, but they've all been on teams in the past. So they've got that weird dynamic, but I found as I wrote them together that there's a real chemistry between these characters. And that's the magic sauce of a team book, is when the characters have chemistry. Because sometimes these things are put together and you just go, why are these guys in the same room together? Not that they don't get along, but they're not vibing, even if they're not supposed to get along, which these characters oftentimes don't get along. But once I found the team, I mean, the chemistry's right, and the writing of these characters, it just kind of flows. So that's been very gratifying. That it's one of those things where you have an idea and now you have to execute the idea, and it seems like the idea is working. So that's very that's a very cool thing to happen, because it doesn't always work this well.
So was Chamber always intended to be a part of this team? Because, obviously we get plenty of books with Wolverine, Deadpool, and Cable on them. We get a little bit of John Proudstar more recently because he's been resurrected because of Krakoa, but you don't always see Chamber. It is kind of got that British sensibility where he's a little bit off-putting. He doesn't want to go with the team and stuff like that. But was that always the plan, to throw him in there just to change the mix up a little bit?
Well, the thing with Chamber for me is I've said this before. I feel like out of all the 90s characters, mutant characters, Chamber is the most visually iconic as far as being a mutant goes, because his power has really fucked him up. It's out there on display. I mean, sometimes he puts on that stupid scarf that sort of tries to hide it, but in his full flower, he looks great. He's tragic in his own way. And again, he's really representative of that 90s era for me. And I put him on the Uncanny X-Men roster that I did back in the early 2000s when I wrote that book, because I just felt like he deserved to be there. He's interesting. And he's one of those characters that looks great, but there's never, except for his first run in Generation X, no one's ever really done anything significant with him. Yeah. So as a writer doing a work for hire gig, you're always looking for those things that you can bring the potential out. And he's just got tons of potential. So that's why he's there.
Are there any plans? Are there, discussions? Are we going to get a Weapon X-Men, volume 2 or something like out of this? Or is there potential for this to become ongoing?
Well, I mean, that's the whole idea. I mean, I pitched it as an ongoing. The problem is at Marvel, it's just the nature of the business that everybody's very trepidatious about how far things are going to go.
Nobody wants to commit.
Yeah, exactly. It's very much a fear of commitment on certain people's part. So I just blaze ahead. I mean, I write these things. I build these things to last. The things that I've contributed to the Marvel Universe in the past, they've stuck around and they've been translated to other media, and they've had some lasting impressions. And I think this one will too. So that's kind of why I'm trying to get the word out. I mean, the only thing that's going to sustain anything these days is word of mouth and sales, and people getting excited about this stuff. And that's harder than ever these days, but we're
it's such a different kind of industry right now, Joe. And I think I mentioned this to you earlier, but I don't think even Marvel Comics themselves, or really even DC to a degree, like think of a comic book as a medium of entertainment, a story to tell. I think they think of it a lot of times as more of a collectible. And I do think it's kind of confused people. Why am I buying this comic book? Is it because of this piece of art on the cover that looks great? And, maybe there's a couple of them that I want to get. But people should be going in there. They should want to pull this bad boy open and read it, in the car before they're even able to leave the parking lot.
I've said it before. The system is a little broken right now. And I think as much as I think it's a healthy thing, ultimately not for Diamond, but it's healthy to have more than one distributor. It's how it used to be in the 80s and the early 90s. I mean, when Diamond became a monopoly, it might have centralized the industry in some ways that you could benefit from, because you could work that system. When there's only one distributor, you can work that system fairly well up until a point. But the problem with having multiple distribution outlets now is that for retailers, it's a slog to go through all those catalogs, those different catalogs every month. So they have to fall back on shorthand. And now the shorthand for what is going to be successful, or what the publishers, especially Marvel and DC, think is going to be successful and want retailers to order heavily on, has a lot to do with variant covers, the number of variant covers. So when you're looking at an order form, not the actual catalog with solicitation info and the blurbs, and where you actually see the cover art and you see the creators that are doing it, but you're just looking at the catalog, just at the line items. All you see is title, issue number, price, and variant cover. Compare most of the From the Ashes launches from last summer would have on average 15 variant covers, especially the top tier books, X-Men, Uncanny X-Men. So if you look at an order form and you see a X-Men #1 with 15 variant covers, the subliminal thought there is, this is a big book. This is a big launch. I'm going to order heavy on this. This is what Marvel is pushing. Then you come to I think Rob Liefeld was going on about this, about Deadpool Team Up, which it's Rob Liefeld, it's Deadpool, other characters involved. I think he got maybe 4 or 5 variant covers. And the same with Weapon X-Men. We had 5 variant covers. To your point, that takes out the content aspect of deciding what is going to work and what's going to sell and what a retailer's customers might want and be interested in. And it just becomes collectability. And it's Kirkman told me once, it was like we're selling trading cards with a story inside. It's a sad state of affairs, but it's sort of the business that we're in right now. And for us as creators, and even on an editorial level, it's a constant uphill battle of this has value, this story has merit, this can connect to an audience on a level that's not just about collectability, but about story and character and emotion. But we got to go that extra mile to make sure that people know about this stuff. There's no Wizard magazine, there's no centralized internet place to go. It gets tougher and tougher to get the word out.
I hadn't thought about the subliminal messaging almost that the retailers, the publishers are doing to the retailers, where you see this whoa, there's 18 variant covers. They must really feel that this is going to be a big book, or wait, this one only has 3 covers on an issue 1. They must not think this is very good, or they would have put way more on that. Where's the Peach Momoko cover? It doesn't even make sense. So it almost trains them to realize they don't have faith in a book like that.
You think about, that's what they want to make their money on. And sometimes it's about, and I don't think this is necessarily the case anymore because comics don't really pay for shit, but it's what they know they got to make their money back on, or even make a massive profit on. It's all about dollars and cents at the end of the day. It's an economic situation. I mean, it's a commercial medium. They want to make money. The thing that's sort of past that I miss is that you can make money on good storytelling. You can make money on content that connects, but there's not as much faith there anymore from the bean counter level, because what do they care? I don't, it used to be that comic books, people who worked in comics did love comics. Even at the executive level, there was an affinity for comic books there, an affinity for what they could do and what they meant to people. That seems to have gone away a little bit. And it's a shame, but we fight the good fight. I mean, you're doing it. Comic book YouTube is doing it. People go out and champion what they love and rail against what they hate, and it's all about passion, man. And that's what we got to keep pushing, is the passion.
Do you think part of that could be that there's like a real disconnect between the leadership and the decision makers, at a Marvel or DC or Image or anywhere, and the audience that they actually have, that maybe they don't even realize at this point what they want, so it's hard for them to even predict what would be a hit?
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, when you have Disney owns Marvel, Warner Brothers owns DC, these are big corporations, huge corporations that are all about the bottom line and about stockholders, and you have to boil it down to what's going to make a profit, what's going to make us more money than it did last year. It's almost like you don't have time to consider what's going to connect with an audience. You can hope for it and hope for the best, but I can't imagine that, there are people in boardrooms going, what are people going to care about? What are people going to invest in emotionally and become really, they're going to take it into their hearts. That's not conversations that are going on a lot when it comes to what's going to make money and what's going to profit.
Yeah, that's probably why we kind of just keep getting the same characters, and a lot of times the same exact story being told over and over again, because what does the really upper management really care about? Oh, a little bit of synergy. I'd like to have something that kind of promotes the movie or whatever cartoon I've got going out. No, you can't introduce this brand new character and highlight them and try and give them a push because we've got a new Spider-Man cartoon coming out. We need to be pushing Spider-Man.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And listen, everybody has to justify their jobs. They have to be able to go to their bosses and say, on paper, this looked good. This looked correct. This looked like the path to making profit. So, you can't begrudge anybody of making a living. Everybody has to live and eat and, put food on their table. When it comes to the arts, it gets to be a little bit murky. And those of us who are committed to the art form are left having to sometimes wear a business hat that we don't always want to wear, or sometimes aren't equipped to wear. But if you want to survive and you want to get your story out there and get the content that you believe in out there, you got to think about this stuff. You got to keep this stuff in mind. And it takes energy. It takes, it takes years off your life sometimes, but we do it because we love what we do. And we want that audience to find it.
Now, I know a lot of people mostly are going to associate you when it comes to mainstream to kind of Marvel stuff. But one of the recent things you did with DC that I thought was just really great was that Kneel Before Zod story. It was kind of different than anything we'd seen. They kind of made Zod this kind of, I don't know, he's a governor of his own world. He's going to create new Krypton. And it wasn't really going anywhere. It wasn't creating exciting storytelling. So you kind of took that status quo. You kill off Ursula. You have this alien attack and then sending Zod kind of out into the abyss. And it was a really cool series. I think it was supposed to be 12 issues, but it just seemed to like halt at 8. I guess you did the best that you could with the time you're given. I imagine it wasn't a big hit on the level of like a Superman proper comic book, but I was really digging it. It seemed like a lot of people were enjoying what was going on there.
Well, here's the thing. This goes back to marketing and how level of awareness is way down on these things. They came to me, and I was interested in working for DC again. I'd done a lot of work in DC in the past. I'm a big fan of DC stuff. The sort of late 80s DC period was my sweet spot. That sort of post-crisis Legends, relaunches left and right. I mean, I love that stuff. So any chance I get to work for DC, I'm happy to do it. They came to me and they said, we want to do this Zod book. I said, great. I wrote Superman back in the day. This is sort of the other side of that coin. Before I'd even really pitched what I wanted to do, we had a vague idea, but I was told that it had been greenlit for 12 issues. Now, I'm not a moron. I was like, really? Are you sure that this is going to go 12 issues? Because this is, a year and a half ago, the market was what it was. I thought, that's optimistic. But they said, no, we got the green light for 12. I said, fine. So I came with the 12-issue outline, started the project, recruited the artist, Dan McDade, got him in on it, and we off and running. The announcement for the book went well. We announced it in San Diego, but the marketing that got to people, to press, was a little confused. I started to get questions like, is this a year one story? Does it take place in the past? Well, how does it connect to the Superman titles? And it was never that. It was meant to be something that was going to lead into Superman stories the following year. That was the whole point of the series, was to bring Zod to a place who could go toe-to-toe with Superman again. And part of that, in my opinion, was to bring him back to being the bastard he was always meant to be. He'd been too domesticated, in my opinion, and DC agreed. So that's the direction we're taking him. But that confused marketing. Retailers not knowing, does this count? Does it not count? Is it off on its own, or is it part of the Superman line? Really affected sales, and they ordered accordingly. They ordered based on the knowledge they had, which in some cases is no knowledge. They just see Kneel Before Zod on the order sheet, and they go, okay, Zod, if they even knew who Zod was. And it's hard to believe that there might be retailers that don't know who Zod is, but I'm sure they were out there. And so I think it suffered from again, that kind of marketing confusion. I mean, it's a problem. It's a definite problem.
I agree with you wholeheartedly. I was like, man, they've really just kind of taken the fangs out of Zod here. And you kind of took his family away. His son was sent off on like some type of Kryptonian, like coming of age type of thing that he had to do on his own. Gets burnt to a crisp, thrown onto this prison ship, comes back, seizes control of it, and has got his own army of essentially murderers. Oh, yep. Man, he's going to do something like pretty spectacular with this. This isn't a hero story. I feel like he's taken this in a really dark direction. But I was like, man, I kind of like this version of Zod. It's nice to see him being a real villain again. Yeah, but I didn't know that it was going to be leading into bigger Superman stories. It was. No one ever told you that.
Yeah, well, that was the problem. And believe me, what was going to happen in the last batch of issues was big and huge. And I mean, that's the other problem with the way things kind of are going right now. The way things are is that it's hard to build to big story content because everything is so front loaded in terms of ordering comics that it's hard to build stories. It's hard to kind of lead up to something because you don't have that much time, which, as a storyteller, it's a real bummer because what was going to happen in the last 4 issues of Kneel Before Zod, ostensibly, 9 through 12, the last act of what I had pitched was huge. And the payoff of everything that had been leading up to it. And again, if they hadn't told me it was greenlit for 12 issues, I wouldn't have built it that way. But I was just going on what I was told. And so it was a bummer not to be able to deliver that real wallop of an ending. And it was big. And I'm telling you, it had been constructed for everything to tie in, everything to call back and wrap up. And what he had done to his planet at the end, where he had cloaked the planet, which was it was called New Kandor, is what that new planet was called. Mm-hmm. Once his wife was killed and his son had banished his son and the planet had been ravaged, he did something to that planet and started this transformation that was going to come back big time in the last act. So for people not to see that it's a shame.
You're right. There just isn't enough investment to where you can really build something up over 12 issues. Right now we're in One World Under Doom, and Dr. Doom taking over the world in Marvel Comics should literally be the biggest comic book event really of this decade. That is an enormous story. That's your maybe number one or number two villain in all of Marvel Comics. He's literally taking over the world. There really was no lead up into it, and you don't really get that with any of these type of things. I think the lead into Dark Crisis on Infinite Earths technically was just Justice League 50, one issue.
Well, I was thinking about this, knowing we're going to talk about this stuff. And I was thinking about, as we're doing this weekend is the big Saturday Night Live 50th anniversary, 50-year anniversary. Now, look, I'm plugged into that world because I've worked in entertainment and stuff. So I've seen all the ramp up. I've seen all of the. They've got documentaries. They've got specials. They've got, ads, news stories about SNL. I mean, it's hard to ignore that this 50-year special, which happens, tonight, live, is coming. If you're paying attention, it seems ubiquitous. There's scaffolding in place to deliver that promotional material. If you're plugged in at all the pop culture, you know it's coming. You know it's out there. Even then, the fracturing of media, I still think there's probably a lot of people who have no idea that SNL is turning 50 and there's a big special and there was a big concert on Friday night. And
I just learned right now, but I live overseas.
Well, but there you go. But there you go. That just shows you that something that is supposedly so huge in pop culture can be, not known by a lot of people that would normally be plugged in. It tells you a lot about the state of media. It tells you a lot about the state of marketing. And that's a big, huge corporate entity. I mean, Comcast, to your point about synergy, has done a lot to synergize that event. And comic books, can't compete in terms of like level of footprint in pop culture. I mean, we're a little tiny corner. So
yeah, it does feel like the marketing, something has to change. I feel like their whole marketing strategy is that you send out a press release and it goes to Newsarama. Maybe you give the Comics Beat an exclusive, and then an hour later it goes to whoever their competitors are. You put out a tweet with a picture, and that is exactly or essentially your marketing campaign.
Yeah.
But there's no interaction. Like there's no way where they're going out there and touching the potential audience and saying, hey, you need to notice me because this cool thing is happening. Even on like YouTube, which I think is, well, it's not easy, but they have enormous subscriber counts. You go to Marvel's YouTube and you might see a baking show and you might get a trailer for a comic book. But I just don't think that's really what engages people anymore. I think people are overstimulated, especially with online entertainment and the amount of stuff that you can just go out there and touch, without really even thinking about it. You do have to, get your hands on them and shake them.
There's no one place that everybody goes anymore. And not to sound like the old man, yelling at clouds, but when I was doing
Wizard Magazine was that place at one point.
Yeah. And online there was Newsarama, there was CBR, and then there were places that everybody went, at least everybody in our industry and everybody that was tangentially connected. And a lot of the audience did too. That doesn't exist anymore. So there's no true north for what's hot, what's not, what's coming, what's, what to keep an eye on. For all of Wizard Magazine's flaws, and there were many, it was someplace that readers, retailers, creators, publishers, everybody could go there and look at that magazine and kind of know what was going on in our business, sort of in one sort of encapsulated package. And that does not exist anymore on any level.
I love the power ranking. You see the pictures, they're like, that guy's still around, he's still great, but there's nobody even really doing any of that stuff anymore.
The thing about it is there's good and bad about that situation. I mean, again, I'm not a fan of monopolies at all. I don't think any one place should have the most power. So on that level,
you're the taste maker and you get to dictate what's cool and what's not cool. And I don't like that guy, so he's not invited to the party. Or I like this person, even though they're not all that talented, so we're going to elevate them and act like they're Alan Moore again or something like that. Yeah, I get you.
Right, but the thing is, if you have that, you can, as a creator, as a whatever, you can define yourself based on your relationship to that centralized entity. Back in the day, you could define yourself by not being in Wizard Magazine. You could campaign on that, but without exactly. And I've worked both sides of that fence, man, in equal measure, because it's there to work, and there's nothing like that now for us to kind of bounce off of or work. I mean, you can work that system or you could work against that system, but you can find a benefit if it's there.
Now, you mentioned Rob Liefeld a little bit earlier and some of the stuff he was talking about. Obviously, he's had a very high-profile public, essentially divorce from Marvel. He had his Observations podcast laying out his grievances, and they kind of all come back to the way he was treated with Deadpool and Wolverine, a movie that went well over $1 billion. I think the Deadpool franchise at this point has gone over $2 or $3 billion between Fox and Disney. And while I do think Rob can be a bit thin-skinned from time to time, I think he was kind of 100% in the right here. The guy has created something that's generated $3 billion worth of box office revenue, and that's just the box office. That's not shirts and toys and all the other things that go along with that. Asking for his name to go up there at the very beginning, title, even if they didn't want to do it, I think a polite phone call explaining their position on that was completely justified and warranted. And I certainly believe that Rob standing there with his family probably deserved an acknowledgement and a handshake from Kevin Feige. And it does just really upset me because I've met so many awesome creators that have put in so much of their blood, sweat, and tears. And then to create something that's generated so much for somebody else, and then for them to not really acknowledge you, that must be incredibly frustrating.
Rob's great. I've known Rob for 25 years, something like that. His company gave me my first professional work in comics. Out of everybody, ironically enough, when I was doing cable, which was my first Marvel gig, there was no one more supportive creatively than Rob. He loved what we were doing. He loved what we were doing with his character, that he created. I'm on the Rob train for sure. And I think it was mistreated, but here's the thing. You can't expect a corporation to love you back. You can put it on individual people, but like we said before, those people have jobs they're trying to do and, whatever. So whether you're on a list for an after party or not, somebody's just doing their job, and you can't take that stuff personal. On the other hand, as creators, we put our blood, sweat, and tears into these things. Rob was really lucky to make good deals on characters he created when he was, 22 years old. So, he's made out like a bandit on Deadpool, and more power to him. He's probably got the best deal in terms of character equity that anybody has ever had, in terms of the success that character has had in other media. It certainly isn't a deal that has been repeated. None of us have ever gotten that deal with the characters we've created. So it's one of those things where you got to go into these relationships with your eyes wide fucking open, and you can't be naive, and you have to expect the worst in terms of how you're treated. Not in a no one's getting killed here. No one's getting, physically hurt. But I just don't, I love comics. I don't expect comics to love me back. That would be an unhealthy relationship.
The Jack Kirby saying?
Yeah, comics will break your heart. You can't, yeah. Luckily he said that before I even got into the business. So I've had that in my head for the past 25 years.
And one of the things we're kind of noticing, and I posit, and it's got to have something to do with this, is we're seeing a lot of really, high level creators still in their prime, still creating great things, and they don't seem to want to work all that often with Marvel or DC. You'll come back in for, hey, I want to do a Superman thing. I'll come back in for some X-Men stuff, but you're still doing quite a bit of work on the indie scene. A lot of people have kind of taken that stance. Mark Miller doing his own thing on Miller World. And there are so many of these luminaries, the way that they've seen that their ideas and creations are treated, and the fact that you aren't really given the acknowledgement that you probably deserve. The case of a Jim Starlin, creating something that generated, $5 billion in box office. I think he ended up getting a better deal in the end, but they weren't exactly congratulating that guy. And I think a lot of people are taking their best ideas with them to their own creator-owned stuff. And, I'll go work for Marvel or DC, but, I've been this developing idea that I've worked on for 10 years is going to go in my project.
Well, that's been going on. The original Image partners demonstrated that. So that's what they pioneered is what the generations after, including myself, always had in mind. So, the arc of a career in comics now is, oddly enough, and you've talked about this before, is to learn your craft at DC and Marvel, and which doesn't necessarily always make for the best comics, but as a creator, you learn your craft, you get your name out there, you establish your reputation, then you go off and do your creator-owned work and hopefully take some of that audience with you.
Yeah, you want to do the Kirkman model, you want to do the Mark Miller model,
Yeah,
where you
yeah.
own your stuff in the end, and hopefully that generates you a lifetime of wealth where you don't have to worry about things anymore.
Yeah, it's fun. It's funny, but I mean the downside of that is that it turns Marvel and DC into the farm teams. That
they're the minor leagues instead of the major leagues that they used to be.
That's right. That's right. So, but again, I wouldn't. I mean, that's a trade-off I'm happy to see for the benefit of the creators. But I don't know if it always makes for the most top-level comics.
Yeah, there'll be a revival at some point. There's going to be a generation where you get like 12 really great creators that really blow something up for a few years and change the game and up the standard. But we're kind of waiting on that. What I think is interesting, the comic book industry is kind of evolving or whatever. I still can't believe Marvel and DC don't have a coherent digital strategy.
Yeah, but I mean, they've got so much invested in print as companies. I think it's also when they figure out how to really make significant money on digital, that's when you'll see the shift. They haven't figured it out yet. They have not figured it out yet.
I think it's the manga way where you make the digital stuff incredibly cheap to where it's a great entry point. There's no barrier to entry because the price is so darn good that once people get into it and they go like, oh, this is my favorite thing ever, then I go to the comic book shop or I go to the bookstore and then I get all the collected editions. And then obviously that's where you make your bounty.
Well, but that takes a leap of faith on the publisher's part to invest in something that they don't know is going to have the return. Having to answer to stockholders and all that kind of shit, they can't afford to make that leap, even though it might have the effect that you want long term. Publishers cannot afford to think long term anymore.
Especially the two biggest being owned by these massive corporations. They're not just going to let you lose money for 2 years. Correct.
It's not even a consideration. I mean, it's funny. It's like it's the Mr. Smith Goes to Washington thing. I mean, if you were somebody who really wanted to change the culture or change the landscape, and you went to a Marvel or DC as an editor, as an executive, whatever, and you were like, we got to do things this way, and we got to think long term, and we got to think about the medium and about the art form, and we got to not worry about making money for the next 2 years because the payoff will be in year 3. You'd be laughed out of the building. I mean, you'd never even get through the door with ideas like that.
I do think that's one of the reasons Western comic books are having a hard time competing with manga specifically, because manga is so widely available and cheap. And I think once people get addicted to it, then you've got to get those collected versions. And I think there's definitely a real path from digital to physical with collections and stuff like that. Because once you become the world's biggest Batman fan or the world's biggest One Punch Man fan, you got to get all of the stuff. You got to get the action figures. You got to get all the collected editions. You got to get the absolute edition. Well, there's an oversized omnibus that's an artist edition. I need to get that, because you want to show off your trophies and really show off kind of who you are with your fandom.
Well, but the funny thing is, to your point, if you are a new reader, no matter what age you are, and you get into Batman, and you think, I got to get more Batman. I mean, going back and seeing what to get, I would do your head in. Oh,
yeah. I mean, there's a lot of Batman.
Yeah, and it's a lot of different Batman too. It's not a consistent depiction of that character that evolves over volumes. I mean, you could take a step back and see how the characters evolved through pop culture, but if you want to read something, it's difficult to kind of find a path that doesn't exclude other great work or doesn't or I mean, it's ridiculous. I mean, if you like Batman, if somebody likes Batman, I could off the top of my head rattle off 4 or 5 things to tell them to go read. But those 4 or 5 things do not connect with each other.
They might contradict each other.
Yes. They're not a linear story. It's crazy.
Manga definitely is. I do think that's one of the other leg ups that they have is it is a linear story. You've got one creative team, essentially one creative voice, and the characters do evolve. But they only evolve one way because there's only one story being told.
We're talking about Kneel Before Zod. I mean, when you're planning for just 12 and you only get 8 issues, that's like, I mean, how can you do anything that's going to, really lay the groundwork for keeping people involved, keeping readers engaged, and building audiences?
Because the payoff was the groundwork. Like, this is what lays the table the foundation for what's coming in the future. You never even got to it.
I've learned these lessons I've gone along. I mean, you know, the lessons I learned on Kneel Before Zod, I've brought to Weapon X-Men. So Weapon X-Men is a lot more, you know, peppy. It kind of moves at a quicker pace because
it's
you never know. Yeah, you never know how long you got. So you're gonna, you know, just
go through like 4 different countries in the first issue.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So, you know,
I love it when X-Men used to do that back in the day. Claremont, they'd start out in one place, and then 24 issues later, the team would have split up. They'd be on every single continent at once, and they'd kind of all meet up to play softball in the end.
That's why I said I usually feel like I have one foot in the old school and one foot in the future, because there are values, storytelling values of those old comics that, if applied right now, could still work. You know, I mean, back in the day when they were just newsstand comics, and you were dependent upon getting readers hooked in one issue. Then you put it all out on the field. You left it all out on the field each and every issue. And you know, we went through a period and I was there for it, about 20, 25 years ago, where it was that writing for the trade and that decompressed storytelling that really did a lot of damage ultimately to keep, you know, once we got to the point where we are now, where there's been whole generations of writers that were influenced by that decompressed storytelling and maybe have a harder time giving you real bang for your buck with each individual comic.
Most issues do not have a conclusion. They have a cliffhanger now.
Yeah.
Which is not as effective to me.
No, I mean, I think, and you know, everybody gives lip services, but it's harder than you think now for some reason, that every single issue should be a satisfying experience. You know, whether it's part one of something or standalone or whatever, it should satisfy on an entertainment level between those two covers every time.
Now, you're not only doing comic books. I see a lot of people probably know that Man of Action is something that I believe you co-created. You guys obviously have had a bunch of success there. What's going on with Man of Action these days?
Well, I mean, we're still doing a lot of animation. We've got right now, it's on YouTube actually, a series for Hello Neighbor, which is a video game that we adapted into a series. We just finished the Sonic Prime series on Netflix.
My kids love that show.
Oh, great. That's great to hear.
Huge fans of Sonic.
Oh, good. Good. So we've got some other things coming up. I mean, so that's been ever since Ben 10, that's been mainly our bread and butter. Ben 10 set us up in that world pretty solidly, and we've been, you know, in it ever since.
Who created the logo for Ben 10? Because that thing is dynamite.
Somebody at Cartoon Network. Yeah,
you can throw that thing on anything, and it just makes it look cool. I think that's the magic. My kids, they like the greed. They like the Ben 10 thing.
Oh, that's
anything
great.
with it on, they kind of dig.
Oh, good. I mean, that again, when something's built to last, it fucking lasts.
So obviously, there's a lot of like parallels between like a Ben 10 and like a Dial H for Hero. Was that intentional, or was that you were looking for a good idea?
I mean, it wasn't that we lifted that idea so much as that we came up with the watch with the alien superheroes, and anytime there's a sort of a, you know, choose your own hero.
Yeah.
You know, it's not the newest idea under the sun. It's hopefully the execution kind of set it apart. It obviously worked. You know, I mean, I would dare say it worked better than Dial H ever did. You know, in terms of success. So, you know,
put forward the cultural zeitgeist. Yeah, I mean, the idea of a kid having a watch and then, you know, oh, I guess I'm going to fly today, or I'm going to be fast. Kids love that stuff. They love acting like superheroes.
What I remember about Dial H for Hero back in the early 80s was that it was the heroes that they would turn into were readers' suggestions. The readers would send in their superheroes. So every superhero in the old series, which didn't last very long, when they brought it back in the 80s, I think, in the early 80s, it was all about readers send in their superhero ideas and they would show up in the comic. It was that, in that respect, it was very cool.
Oh, that is cool. That's interaction. That's kind of letting the readers know that they're important. And I feel so jealous because back in the day, the letters page was almost as entertaining as a comic book could be, but now it's like emails or something.
Yeah, I wrote a few letters into. I'd hacked the letter column system back in the '80s because I wanted to see my name in print. Blood Squad 7 has a fairly entertaining letters page that we try to keep going, but yeah, it's kind of a lost art, the letters page.
Yeah, because that used to be the majority interaction that the publisher or the writer, the editor would have with the readers was the letters pages. But now you kind of get that interaction on a daily basis, and kind of the magic's off. But it's unfortunate. I've got a 5-year-old. Yeah, we were talking about kids being superheroes. You see my corner here?
Sure.
That corner there? He climbs that corner every single day and tells me he's Spider-Man.
Yeah, I mean superheroes conceptually will never go out of fashion. The trick is for us as creators, and especially when we write these characters that have been around forever, is to make sure that we still can hook in those readers, and make sure that they feel like we're still invested, so they can invest, and that's how the thing perpetuates. I mean, we're in the world now where you can get these superheroes, you can get the content in all kinds of different forms: movies, video games, TV, comics. Used to be just comics, but now
there's all kinds of YouTube shows where people take their toys and they do like stop animation and stuff. It's cool.
It's great, but it puts more pressure on the comics, which to me is always the source material, to be that much better, to be that much more engaging and individualistic, and we constantly have to remind people why we're the source material, why it springs out of our medium. That's one of the reasons why Weapon X-Men, I was determined, to use these characters at their most essential forms. I don't give a fuck about whether or not Deadpool has a daughter or a dog, or whether there's a teenage version of Cable, or whether or not Wolverine has a son. Fuck all that. This is those heroes in their most primal incarnations, because that's what I would want to read.
So I can't let you go away without asking about this. My buddy Doc, obviously we've been doing the Comics Aficionados for like over 6 years together, been on the channel with me a lot. He says that Wildstorm is the best comic book universe ever created. And I've read Planetary. Right now I'm reading Sleeper. And he always talks about Wildcats 3.0 and why Joe Casey, how you did this great thing. And, when you look back at Wildstorm, obviously it's a Jim Lee thing, but you got like Brett Booth, you got Joe Casey, you got all these amazing creators that came out of there, Eric Canetti, friend of the channel. What was Wildstorm like? And did you know that Wildcats 3.0 was just going to be something that amazing?
I think I don't know if I wouldn't know if I would say it was the greatest universe ever created. But what happened was around the turn of the millennium, here's what was going on at Wildstorm at the time in terms of what was being published. There was Warren Ellis doing The Authority and Planetary. And then Mark Miller and Frank Quitely came on and did the Authority. There was Ed Brubaker was starting to do stuff there. I started out doing a series called Mr. Majestic with Ed McGuinness and a co-writer, Brian Holguin, and I moved on to Wildcats. So I first worked with Sean Phillips and then Dustin McGuinn on 3.0. There was Alan Moore.
Just think about all those names, by the way.
Yeah.
On one little company.
Alan Moore was doing ABC titles there. The first, all those books were going on there. So I think pound for pound, Wildstorm was the most interesting imprint anywhere in comics. Now, what happened was Marvel came in and basically strip mine almost everybody. They got me back. They got Mark. They got Quitely.
Put them all in the Ultimate Universe.
Yeah. They got Hitch. Brubaker eventually went to Marvel and did Captain America. So Wildstorm was one of those things that the talent bench was very deep. And it showed other publishers, particularly Marvel, what was the next wave of hip creators. And they came in and they got all of us back, because we'd all worked for Marvel in the past at various times. I'd worked for Marvel, Mark had worked for Marvel, Hitch had worked for Marvel quite a bit in the 90s. But we went to Wildstorm. Wildstorm gave us a lot of creative freedom, and we ran with it. And we were out to prove something. We were out to show what, in this case, superhero comics could be if we were given a lot of rope. And we did. Now, I would say that the sales success of Wildstorm was mid. There were not many huge sellers, but they were the hippest comics at the time. They were the best, most well-crafted comics. And of course, the downfall of it was that, we started to get a little, not big-headed, but we were pushing the envelope a little further than DC wanted us to. So when Marvel came knocking, and this was the Bill Jemas, Joe Quesada Marvel, they sort of promised in a certain way that we could do it at Marvel now what couldn't do at Marvel before, and what Wildstorm wasn't letting us do. We went over and did that. Now, I stayed at Wildstorm even as I did work at Marvel, and that's where I did books like Wildstorm or Wildcats 3.0 and Automatic Kafka and The Intimates. But the writing was on the wall, and it just couldn't sustain itself. It's like the Blade Runner light that burns twice as bright, burns half as long. That was Wildstorm. But
do you think Wildstorm could ever have a logical place, like physically, in the DC Universe Prime? Because I just don't think it works.
No, I don't think so either. I think if you bring the Authority into the DC Universe, they're bad guys. They should do that. But I think there's, you get into sentimentality and people not wanting to potentially ruin characters or whatever. And of course, the Authority is supposed to have this movie coming out, so why risk that? I mean, there's a lot of factors involved, but in its prime, I don't think there was a better, like I said, pound for pound, a better imprint of comics in the mainstream than Wildstorm, circa 2000, 2001.
Me personally, I haven't read nearly, obviously, as much Wildstorm as Doc, but we read Planetary with Warren Ellis and John Cassaday.
It's great.
A lot of his amazing ideas about multiverses and how they operate and how they kind of touch each other, everyone borrowed those ideas because they were literally impeccable. And John Cassaday, on his best day, doing all these different genres, widescreen, Hong Kong action movies, and doing kaiju films and doing the Matrix homages and everything. It was pretty mind-blowing.
Not to mention, if you can trace this, you can connect these dots. If it wasn't for Brian Hitch on the Authority doing that widescreen comic book thing, sort of, cinema specific, we wouldn't have gotten the Ultimates, which begat the Marvel Cinematic Universe. There's a lot that Wildstorm is responsible for.
Absolutely. It's part of the legacy, and they got to figure out what to do with Wildstorm, but every time it feels like DC's got a plan, they end up dropping it.
When these characters they're not knockoffs, but they're kind of mirrors of established superheroes. It's hard to put them up next to those iconic superheroes, and they don't really hold up.
And DC's never going to let their version of Superman lose to another version of Superman.
That's right. That's exactly right. Mr. Majestic works in his own universe. When you put him next to Superman, he doesn't work at all. At all.
Yeah. Congratulations, obviously, on Weapon X-Men. Now that it's finally coming out, I've been hearing about this book for so many years. I do appreciate the fact that I was able to get my hands on it and read it. Really, really good stuff. Criss Cross, love seeing him come back, and I think people should be very, very excited about it. Is there anything else that people should know about Weapon X-Men or anything else that you got brewing right now?
Well, just that we're trying to buck the trend. I mean, we're trying to keep people engaged and invested and not make it I bought issue 1 because it's the number 1 issue, and I've satisfied my collector's itch. This is a comic book that begs to be read and followed, and I put as much blood, sweat, and tears into this comic as I would any of my creator-owned material, which is, maybe stupid on my part, but that's how you have to do these things with as much commitment as you would something that you're going to own for the rest of your life. I have no stake in Weapon X-Men other than doing the best superhero comic book that I can and get people excited. Like I was excited by books when I was a kid and even as an adult reading superhero comics. It's a big mountain to climb, and we're doing the best we can. And I appreciate you having me on and helping me spread the word, and I appreciate you reading the book and liking it, and I hope a lot of other people do the same. It's the only way we're going to survive.
Absolutely. It was my great pleasure to have Joe freaking Casey on the channel. Another awesome day for me. And definitely, if you're a fan of Wolverine, Deadpool, and Cable, I don't imagine there ain't many people out there that are. This is definitely going to be the book for you. So congratulations and big day coming up on Wednesday, and really appreciate the time, Joe.
Thanks, Wes. I really appreciate being here.